So we're just going to go to our last speaker now, who is Nina from Canada. And the title of Nina's talk is So Much for Work-Life Balance in Canada, A. And Nina was a volunteer in the 1990s in gay and lesbian organisations. She's worked for 7 federal government departments, reading and applying legislation, and is going to talk to us about the situation in Canada and other things. So thank you so much, Nina. Tell us what you found out.
Well, firstly, I'll start just briefly with the 1990s and volunteering. I was at the Vancouver Women's Health Collective, the Lesbian Avengers, and most importantly, the Vancouver newspaper Angles. This published from 1980 until 2004. It began as the gay and lesbian newspaper, and this is the December 1992 issue where bisexual was added. And bisexual, so the paper published from 1980 till 2004, bisexual was added in 1992, and I achieved this by bringing up the issue in very many meetings. It was starting to be discussed in the gay press and the Washington Blade in particular, and the phrase lesbi-gay was adopted. Bisexuals were deemed sexual tourists. They were not illegal in law. They were only criminally charged in Canada if they were caught with gays and lesbians. And so over 3 months of discussing bisexual, I had a number of gay men admit to me that they confessed that they were bisexual, and I was accused of being bisexual. So at a meeting where it was a lesbian's turn to chair and I was the only lesbian on the collective, I pointed out that if we did not add bisexual explicitly, I would be required to name names and remove men from the voting collective, and then we would not have quorum and we would not even have an issue to publish that month. So the gay men could not vote fast enough to add bisexual to the masthead. And there was a page 1 feature article that was written. And this was the first time an article was ever asked to be reprinted by another newspaper. The University of Victoria reprinted the bisexual article because this is when it was first really being talked about. Now, I later left the paper because I was the only lesbian with gay men and bisexual men, and I tried to find lesbians. And it was my understanding later that when trans was added, it was done not by a collective vote. The trans volunteer could not get everyone to agree because we knew this was a fetish and self-loathing. And so it ended up being added before the paper finished by the trans person simply offered to take the camera-ready art to the press, and after everyone else left, simply made the change throughout the magazine, and then it could not be undone. Angles ultimately finally finished publishing in 2004 because the Toronto newspaper Extra had tried to do a deal with Angles, which the collective didn't actually discuss, and because it was not told to us by the one gay man who was sort of in charge of Angles. He was there at Angles from the entire run of the paper. He was the only volunteer who was there the entire time. And so the city was not big enough for there to be 2 newspapers, and Extra West at its peak published in Toronto. It published Extra West in Vancouver. It published Island Extra in Vancouver Island, Calgary Extra, and then Ottawa Extra. In 1994, when the International Gay and Lesbian Association, which was the first non-government group to have United Nations advisory status, was told by the United Nations, of your 168 organizations, 30 of them are pedophile groups. You cannot be a human rights advisor if you support pedophiles. So those groups were kicked out, and another 20 groups, significantly including Extra in Toronto, quit the organization in support of the pedophiles. Extra West's then lesbian editor, Cindy Filipenko, wrote an anti-NAMBLA editorial and was fired. Horrifyingly, Ken Popert was the man in Extra who fired her, and he was partners with Brian Mossop, who was a federal government employee who ended up being the case in Canada that led to gay and lesbian employees no longer being purged from the federal government and getting eventually same benefits as heterosexual employees. So for me, after I was out of the volunteering, I was working in the nonprofit sector, and then I got a job at a small law office. And then I ended up working in the federal government in the post-Brian Mossop era. The government of Canada from the 1950s until 1992 was purging the public service of gay and lesbian employees under the Government Security Act, because as gays and lesbians, we were a blackmailable security risk because we couldn't be government employees. So there was that. I then became a government employee in 1998. My first department of 7 was Revenue Canada. And Revenue Canada the entire government rolled out a diversity program. And diversity was said to avoid saying the words gay and lesbian. And the Employment Equity Act, which I talked about in my previous WDI talk, covered women, visible minority, disabled, and Indigenous. The employment equity groups did not want there to be a 5th category added because they didn't want the budget divided by 5. And they feared the gay and lesbian group would outperform them, which at Revenue Canada did in fact happen. The other 4 groups basically were, at 3 of the groups, men were at the table and women made the coffee. And in the women's group, the white women were at the table and all the other women made the coffee. And also you could only pick one category. So if you were a woman who could fall into more categories, you had to pick one. Whereas when the Gay and Lesbian Committee met, and we had to fight for 3 months to not have support in the name of the committee, we all brought our own lattes and worked across the table. We actually were the first government group to march in the Vancouver Pride Parade, and we were terrified to be out to the community because we were not there looking for votes or money. We were not technically a community group, and it took us a while to realize we represented hope and being actually part of Canada, because
and what year was this? I know you've said, but
1998. It was also the first year the Vancouver Pride Parade was broadcast on regional television. Now in government, I was the only one out for my first 6 departments. I met other gays and lesbians and bisexuals, and even at one department, a man who was dressing as a woman as trans. And honestly, everyone just had this pretend it's normal, weird thing that was being directed there, whereas there was absolute denial of gays and lesbians. So it was the government of Canada for a long time. I had in my HR, I was common law partnered, and at Industry Canada, my third department, I actually got married, and then Canada's marriage law happened in 2003, and the government of Canada had a one-time in your career 1-week marriage leave code. So if you weren't married, it was obviously just for heterosexuals for a long time. And after 2003 and marriage equality, the union actually gave away that marriage leave code, and they changed it to a generic, everyone gets 1 week for whatever reason they want. So I was actually at one department able to get that one-time only leave to get married. And then when they replaced the code at the same department, I got that leave again, only this time I used it because my dog had surgery. And in 2000, so Revenue Canada was my first department. Then I worked at the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And this is an actual RCMP forage cap. The badge has been removed. And this is a possible whistleblowing thing because the government security policy prevents government employees from talking about secret government stuff. But the Stephen Harper government passed another law restricting civil service from talking about their workplace in a much more substantial way that I have not been trained on, because by the time that passed, I was already had my career ended by Transport Canada. So I was not an RCMP officer. I have never worn this hat outside of the house. And I will share the story of how I acquired this hat now, and this will be probably whistleblowing. I was at lunch at RCMP headquarters, and I was the only person in the room who did not have a uniform or a gun. And there was a very butch corporal who everybody pretended was not a butch corporal. And so she said at lunch, Nina, you keep saying you want a forage cap. Why don't you just go to Depot and get the whole uniform? So I quickly looked around the room to make sure nobody had food or a drink about to go in their mouth. And I said, it's really more of a fetish than a lifestyle thing for me. And that, I mean, that was totally a joke. And everybody just sort of stopped and just gasped and was shocked. But there was one male corporal who he did something I didn't know the human body could do. He blushed so hard from his diaphragm that he just turned instantly red that I actually refer to it as a Rocky Horror Picture Show wipe. And then the next day, I got an email from the butch corporal asking me to go up to her office. And she said, I have been given permission to give you this hat so you never make that joke again. So I also worked at the Immigration and Refugee Board, which is the only time I ever shared a link that had any effect. I saw an article about UN aid workers who were molesting children instead of providing them food and aid. And I printed the article and I was working at Immigration and Refugee Board, and there was a United Nations office that was embedded in the Refugee Board. And I went to that office, knocked on the door, and I heard the woman hiding inside her office, and I pushed the article under her door. And she showed up at my workstation a couple hours later to tell me that she had a feeling it was me when she heard the knock, and that she's now phoned New York and let them know. That was 2009. That story repeats in the news every 2 to 3 years. So this is where I become not surprised in a way that the UN is now promoting pedophiles in terms of the queer theory. Now, in terms of working in government and having legislation that then you need to apply, and my job was to read legislation and create forms so that other people could apply it in their jobs. So to take an idea like gender ID, which is a sexual self-image, and try to give that the force of law is to do the exact opposite of what the Magna Carta did in the first place, which was to create a commonly understood law that was not at the whim of the monarch. And gender ID allows anybody to self-ID and not only void the rights of others, but void the protected rights of others. And the Canadian Charter of Rights gave women direct rights access to language and own ideas, and the freedom from discrimination. And self-ID was allowed to undermine employment equity. When I worked at Indian Northern Affairs, I hope this one will really get me in trouble with the Department of Justice. There was a man who kept saying he was Indigenous, and he kept changing the generation this alleged grandmother was. And one day he went that even too far and claimed she was a princess. So I asked him if she was from the Disney tribe. I lost my job because of being a lesbian and an atheist, and I was discriminated as a woman across 7 departments, with Department 7, Transport Canada, being the worst, to where I am actually named in the manager's handbook to the Canada Labor Code Part 2 as the example of workplace bullying managers can get away with. They actually removed me from the workplace with Vancouver City Police and took me to St. Paul's Hospital, a religious hospital, and held me for 3 hours without charter rights. I couldn't sign myself out. And I have not had rights in Canada ever since. And I have gone through the BC Police Complaints Commission, the Federal Human Rights, and I was self-represented at the Federal Court and the Federal Appeals Court. I have filed the paperwork for the Supreme Court, and I'm continuing to wait for a file number. And in the meantime, I have done everything I can from my positions of responsibility that I once upon a time had, including writing to former Governor General Julie Payette and telling her to resign, and telling her staff if she was a bully that they need to file grievances, which they duly did. And Julie Payette is the first Governor General of Canada to ever resign.
And you're pretty active now, having with all this experience and understanding of what goes on inside these institutions. Are you active in trying to sort of lobby or change the laws? Or yes. I know you're really active in WDI, yeah.
Yes, I have been also directly in contact with there used to be a status of women in Canada, which the Harper government removed equality and then defunded that department from 17 offices to 5. And then that caused the massive defunding of women's nonprofit groups across Canada. And then after that, the trans lobby swooped in and human rights complained against women. And it was not, it's not women who were doing the murdering and harm. And it's very, very telling to me that even the men who self-ID as women are not saying men are murdering us, partly because they are seeking out their murderers for sexual thrill. So, as a lesbian, my suggestion to men who self-ID as women is if you don't want to get murdered, stop having sex with men. It worked for us, right? So it's really quite ridiculous, but gender ID caters to a sexual self-image and it denies ordinary human senses. If there's such a thing as a trans soul, there would be a trans body. Mammals do not change sex. And we do not self-impregnate. That gets to be for reptiles and fish. That's not something that mammals can continue to do. Little wrap up. After I became disability retired because of PTSD, I tried to find a place I had to go volunteer. So I returned to the Vancouver Women's Health Collective in 2021. I discovered that they are now having men there. They have makeup mirrors for drag queens, and all of the work of the collective from the 1970s, the medical information translated across languages, and the referral service for all the women's nonprofits across the province has been destroyed, shredded, gone. That's a hate crime under the world level court. That is beyond going after women. That was destroying the archive history and all the work of the organization. It was the one place women could go to get help with their doctors against the BC College and also get medical information and support. And now there's makeup mirrors for drag queens.